Hello everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Families for Child and Youth Mental Health and the Forces in the Know. Funding is provided by the BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services, an agency of the Provincial Health Services Authority, and by the BC Ministry of Children and Family Development. My name is Liz Irving, and I'm a parent in residence in Vancouver. This and all our previous In the Know webinars can be viewed from our video library on our website at any time. In the Resources section, you will find a downloadable copy of the PowerPoint from this webinar, as well as supporting resources. Our topic today is supporting children who have experienced trauma, and our speaker is Carrie, DeJong, a registered clinical counselor who has over 18 years working experience with trauma. Her therapeutic approach is rooted in understanding how trauma impacts a person's life. She is passionate about helping people move through places of challenge into greater health and wholeness. And it is my pleasure to welcome Carrie DeJong.
Thank you, Liz. And it's a privilege to get to speak to parents about such an important topic of trauma. And so I'm very thankful for the opportunity to speak this morning. And we're going to be going through a broad range of concepts about what trauma is, how it impacts children emotionally, behaviorally, mentally, relationally, and we're going to learn, we're going to cover lots of information about how trauma impacts the body, because that's really where the impacts of trauma start. And if we understand that, we start understanding more about how trauma shows up in all of those places, behaviorally, cognitively. And then we're also going to talk about how to support children in their healing. And Peter Levine has done some phenomenal work, the somatic experiencing practitioner who has really revolutionized our concept and our understanding of the impacts of trauma. And Peter Levine says this. He says, trauma is a fact of life, but so is resilience. And that's the piece that I want to start off by talking about. Trauma is inevitable in life. We all have experienced it, and all of our children will experience trauma. But resilience and being able to tap into what helps children recover and heal is part of what we're going to talk about today. So, when we talk about trauma, we talk about people having an experience of being overwhelmed. And they're overwhelmed physically or emotionally in some capacity. And there is a subjective sense of threat. The threat can be real, or it can be a subjective, experiential sense of threat. It doesn't have to be something that all people experience as a threat. And that's something that's really important to understand. And it's important to understand because children experience threat differently than an adult does, or even a teenager does. So we have to understand that when something was threatening to someone, if they felt threatened, they felt threatened. That's what constitutes a trauma. And then there's a sense of helplessness also about that experience. And trauma doesn't have to just happen to the person themselves. It can also be the experience of witnessing another person experiencing trauma. And we even know from experiences of children who witness violence in the home, often their trauma is as great or greater than children who were traumatized themselves by violence in the home. And so simply witnessing violent and traumatic experiences to someone is also a very significant experience of trauma. And so we talk about what trauma is and how it impacts the thing. There's also a few other things we need to know. So trauma can be a one-time event. It can be that experience of an accident or an assault. It can be that experience of being bullied. So it can be a one-time event, but it can also be a condition that's a little bit more more pervasive, or something that's a little more subtle than the one-time event. And it can be things like growing up in an experience of poverty, growing up with a parent who either has an illness or a mental illness or an addiction. It can be growing up in an environment that's relatively unsafe, a community or a culture that has some inherent lack of safety to it. It can be growing up in a community where bullying is rampant. And so there doesn't have to be just that one event. It can be things that are more subtle but carry on for a longer period of time. And so we also need to include that in our understanding of what trauma is. The other thing that I want to say is trauma is universal. We have all experienced trauma. And as I said at the beginning, our children will all experience trauma. And it is to live on the face of this earth is actually to experience trauma. And so we have to be able to understand how to help us and our children move through it. Trauma is also on a continuum. And it's important to recognize that when we talk about, let's say, accidents, there is a minor fender bender, and then there is a traumatic experience of an accident that happens where there's loss of life or there is significant physical impairments that happen. You know, so it's on a continuum. Or we talk about relational trauma, and there's the one-time experience of being bullied that is traumatic. But there's also the experience of having profound physical or sexual or emotional trauma that happens at the hands of a parent or a caregiver that's at the other end of the trauma. And so all of it is on the trauma spectrum. But there's a continuum of how impactful it is that we need to pay attention to. Trauma is also cumulative. And I'm going to use my water bottle as an example. We talk about trauma, and there's this idea that we're meant to have lots of room in our container, in our nervous system, to experience the consequences of trauma. And we have a traumatic experience, and we empty out some of that activation. But it doesn't maybe all leave us, and then we have another trauma, and we don't get back to our baseline, and then we have another one. And eventually, over time, unless we're aware of what helps us move back down into a place of calm and centeredness, we end up accumulating the impacts of trauma over the course of our life. And the same is true for our children. And then, as I said in the beginning also, trauma is subjective. And how we think of that is two people can experience the exact same event, and yet they have very different responses to it. And some of that can be because of personality, it can be because of previous histories, it can be because of temperament, it can be because of age, or how that they experience that particular event. So these are all different lenses that we can look at trauma and understand how the impact can be varied depending on what it was that happened. And so let's talk a little bit about a variety of different things that are traumatic experiences. I think in the past, and even a number of years ago, we used to think that trauma was really those significant events that happened outside of the realm of normal life. Things like war, terrorism, profound assaults or abuse, things that were at the far end of the spectrum were what we used to think constituted a trauma. And the more we understand, the more research we do, the more awareness we have, we realize that trauma is far more pervasive and more things constitute a trauma than we ever thought before, which is not bad news. It just helps us understand ourselves better. So let's talk about some of those things. And I'm really grateful that medical procedures happen and that we have such great health care. But it's important to recognize that medical intervention, medical and dental intervention, is traumatic to our nervous system. And I'm going to talk about our nervous system in a little bit. So as we just identify all of these different experiences of trauma, I'm going to then talk about how they all impact our nervous system. So medical and dental procedures, and that includes things that happen very early on, even in pregnancy. So when there's a complication in pregnancy, when there's a complication in delivery, early childhood experiences, febrile seizures, falls. Every child falls. And so it's important to understand that some of these things can be traumatizing to children, and they add to that cumulative nature. The second one is things like high impact falls. Like I said, car accidents, concussions, all of those things add to that container. The third section is the one that we most often view or think about when we're talking about traumatic experiences, and we think of abuse, and we think of what happens in the context of relationships. And this is a broad category. It can include bullying. It can include the things that we often view as trauma, like neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, assault. But it can also be the harassment kinds of things. It can be the kinds of things where there's abandonment and loss of relationship due to divorce or adoption or parental absence for a variety of reasons, whether it's illness or mental illness or whether it's parental addiction. All of those things fit under that category of relational trauma. And then we have a third kind of trauma that is a unique one. It's called global activation trauma. And this is really when our nervous system is activated to its fullest and there is no access to resource that might help us change that. So we can't fight or flee that experience. And it's things like seizures. It's things like high fevers, hallucinations. It's early trauma under the age of 2. So prenatal and perinatal trauma into early toddlerhood is also experiences of global activation trauma. It just simply means that the nervous system is activated to its fullest extent and there's no option of helping alleviate that traumatic experience. And so when we think of early childhood trauma, this global activation trauma is something to pay attention to. And I wish we had more time to talk about it, but I'm simply mentioning it to help you as parents understand all of the different things that might load your child's nervous system when we're talking about trauma and what might be adding to their container that we need to pay attention to, and why some of those behaviors might be occurring and why some of those cognitive patterns might be happening. And so let's talk a little bit about our nervous system. And so we have our autonomic nervous system is really the part of our nervous system that governs all of the things that we don't have to think about. We don't have to think about digesting breakfast. We don't have to think about regulating our temperature. We don't have to think about blinking or our heart beating. Our autonomic nervous system takes care of all of those things for us. And our autonomic nervous system contains 2 distinct branches called the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic one is the one that's sort of the active one, the one that when we're busy going, when we're caught in traffic, when we're giving a lecture, when we're having a stressful experience. This is the side of our autonomic nervous system that takes over. And it does things like our heart beats faster and our stress hormones increase and we breathe more rapidly to get more oxygen into our nervous system. And so this is essentially the gas pedal in our nervous system. It's kind of the one that says, go, you're on. And then we have another branch of our nervous system called the parasympathetic one. And this one is the rest and digest. This one is the one that helps our immune system function, and this is the one that kicks into gear and helps us digest breakfast and helps us be restful and sleep and heal and boost our our immune system. And ideally, when we're healthy, we toggle back and forth between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic numerous times in a day. In fact, numerous times in a minute. Sometimes we can be moving back and forth between these 2. And again, this one's the gas pedal. This one's the fight or flight response. This one is the rest and digest, the slow, the calm system in our body. And like I said, ideally, we're meant to move back and forth between those 2. But if we understand what trauma does to our nervous system, and we understand what it does to our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, we start understanding the impacts of trauma. And trauma is not in the event. It's not in what happened. Trauma is actually in our nervous system and how our nervous system responds to trauma. And so let's talk a little bit more about that. That, by the way, is a quote from Peter Levine, whose work, as I said earlier, really forms the basis for our understanding of trauma and its impacts. And, if we look at the next slide, when we talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, we talk about the gas pedal and the brake. We talk about the go versus rest. We talk about the output of energy and the storing of energy is really what we need to understand. And what trauma is is it's a maximum activation of this one. It's a maximum activation of our sympathetic nervous system. So this means that it is pushed to its limit. And when it's pushed to our limit, the parasympathetic one, the calm system, is turned off. And we are in a go at the fullest capacity that we have when we have a traumatic experience. And so that's part of what we need to understand when we start understanding the impacts of trauma. And so what do we mean when we talk about our fight or flight mechanism or our sympathetic nervous system being at its maximum is really this, it's an instinctive response to stress and threat, first of all. It's all of the stress hormones get dumped into our system, cortisol and adrenaline, and it produces the urges of fight or flight. And as I said earlier, it means that the gas pedal is fully on, right? And so this is what's happening when we have a traumatic experience. But there's also a third response. When we talk about fight or flight is here, there's also a third response called the freeze response. And when we're overwhelmed, when our nervous system is activated at its fullest capacity, and this is a tricky one we need to understand, our nervous system will slam on the brakes simultaneously. So we have all of the energy of the sympathetic nervous system, and the brake gets thrown on with the parasympathetic one, and it's like a car with the gas pedal fully on, and then we throw the brake on, and the wheels are spinning. And so it's this idea that we're overwhelmed and we're moving into shutdown. It's not that we suddenly feel better. It's that there's so much energy, there's so much going on. A child can be so overwhelmed that all of a sudden they go into a freeze or shut down or overwhelmed. And the freeze response, unfortunately, is very common in traumatized children. And we need to understand that when we start seeing some of the behaviors of trauma that show up for children. And it will make sense when we view it from that lens that this is what happens for children, that their nervous system gets overloaded. They have less opportunities to fight or flee, and they have less resources. If they're a 2-year-old experiencing a profound trauma, whether it be, a fall or an accident or an illness or a medical intervention, or maybe being scared by a dog that, attacked them or bit them, they have no opportunity to fight or flee. So they go into a freeze response. And we need to understand that when we start understanding the impacts of trauma. I want to talk a little bit about the Triune brain model. And this is really important to understand when we start talking about knowing our nervous system and understanding why we and why our children behave the way they do, why emotions show up the way that they do, why cognitive things show up the way that they do. And it's really important that we understand our brain and how it's wired. And the Triune brain model was developed by Dr. Paul MacLean, probably back in the 70s, and it's really formed our understanding of how our brain is wired in a hierarchy. And they are 3 interacting systems. It's not that they're entirely separate, but they're 3 very distinct systems. And Dan Siegel uses his hand model, and I'll refer to that as well. And so it's this idea that when we make a fist, this sort of represents the same diagram of our brain as the slide represents. And so when we talk about our brain, in the Triune brain model, we talk about our brainstem and the part of our brain back here in our brain, that regulates all of the parts of our nervous system we don't have to think about, our autonomic nervous system. It is the part of our brain that governs all of those systems we don't need to think about. Heart, digestion, breathing, brain activity, blood pressure, all of those things are governed here. And if we understood the language that this part of our brain speaks to us in, it's in the language of sensation. So when we're nervous and we get, our heart beats a little bit faster, or we get butterflies in our stomach, or when our hands get sweaty when we're anxious, that's the language of our brainstem speaking to us in the language of sensation. And it's really important that we understand that. The second part of our brain that I want to talk about is our limbic system, and it's buried deep in the middle of our brain. And this part of our brain contains the systems for emotions and for experiencing and regulating emotions and for storing emotional memories. It's also the place that our pleasure reward center is housed, and it's also the place that is the alarm bell in our nervous system. If there was a fire alarm somewhere in our brain, it's in our limbic system in a place called, in a little structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the fire alarm that sends the messages elsewhere into our brain and helps us respond to threat. And if there was a language that our limbic system speaks in, it's the language of emotion. And so emotional experiences, emotional memories, emotional responses. And the interesting thing to understand, and to help you even understand for your children, is this part of our brain is fully developed in utero, early on in utero. This part of our brain starts coming online in utero also, and it's almost fully formed at birth and kind of goes through some finishing touches in the first few months and the first year of life. And so we start understanding that threat. And remember I talked about the fire alarm is here? It's fully functioning at birth, actually in the third trimester. And so threat can be experienced by an infant or even an infant before it's born. So we need to understand that. And then when we talk about our human brain, our cortex, our big, beautiful human brain that is the source of our ability to make good decisions, rational judgment, our ability to have language or morals or spirituality, creativity, abstract thinking, logical, rational thought is here. And it's what constitutes our human brain. And this is the part of our brain that speaks to us in the language of thought and cognition. And it's also the part of our brain that's not fully developed until we're sometime in our mid-20s. And it's not even really functioning in infancy and toddlerhood. That's why we can't rationalize or reason with toddlers, right? It's that idea that it's not developed. So we can't even have the ability to have a rational conversation with a toddler because this part of their brain isn't even developed yet. And when we talk about who calls the shots in our behavior or in the behaviors of children, these two parts of our brain really are the senior partners, and they have the ability to hijack our thinking brain in a millisecond. And that's also an important piece to understand. And so when there's things rattling around in our limbic system, anger, fear, anxiety, unresolved threat, that keeps these two places in high gear and has the ability to literally hijack rational thought, the ability to make good decisions and respond in a way that might be more appropriate, cognitively appropriate, right? And so this is also what I think is important to help parents understand how your child's brain is functioning and why even things like learning might be hard when this part of a brain of a child or even of an adult is rattled. It makes this part of the brain really difficult to remain online, and that's why we have learning difficulties for children who have had traumatic experiences and who have anxiety. It's simply, I often say it's like if you're out for a walk and suddenly a black bear crosses your path and you're running afraid away from that black bear. If I were to ask you what's 3 times 7 as you're running, I don't think you'd have the ability to answer that question, even though you would know that the answer is 21 in a time when you're not anxious. But when you're in a fight or flight response, your cognitive brain literally is rendered useless to some degree and isn't functioning to its fullest capacity. And that's also a piece that we need to know and understand for children who are experiencing trauma. And so that is a piece that's really important to understand. And then I want to talk about, when we talk about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, there's really 2 categories of symptoms that show up. when a child, when an adult has had traumatic experiences, there's really two very distinct categories that we need to be able to see and understand. The first one is hyperarousal or activation, and it's the intrusive symptoms, and it's when we see the anxiety and the fear and the temper tantrums, and there's flashbacks or nightmares and terrors, and there's sort of a bigness to the experience, and there's too much activation going on. That's the hyperarousal symptoms of trauma. But then, and sorry, before I go on to the other one, the hyperarousal are really this branch, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. But then the second category of trauma symptoms are the hypoarousal, the under-aroused, when the freeze response gets turned on. And these are the things that are avoidance symptoms, the numb and shut down, and the freeze responses, and the withdrawal symptoms, and the numbing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on in just a few minutes. And so, again, we want to be aware that trauma symptoms tend to fall in either one of these two very significant categories, that it's important to understand that those categories exist because it helps us understand those behaviors. I want to introduce you to a model that I've developed that really helps us understand nervous system activation and how stress shows up in our nervous system, and also the corresponding behaviors. And really it's this idea that we move from a state of calm when our nervous system is able to move back and forth, into increasing activation, into high activation, into a freeze response, and then into something I call oblivion. And so let's take a moment to go through this, and hopefully it will help you understand and get a perspective of things. There's the state of calm that ideally we have connection to. At times we have those moments, or our children have those moments, where our nervous system is able to rest, where we're able to sleep and recuperate, where we're able to have a sense of calm, when we're able to connect to people that help us settle and ground, when we're doing things that bring rest to our nervous system. Whether it's gardening or vacation or drawing or out for a walk, it's really this idea that we can find that state of calm when we're emotionally stable, or when our children are stable, when there's this ability to cope, when there's this ability to experience being grounded and relaxed. Healthy connection with others. The ability to learn happens when there's manageable activation in our nervous system also. But life doesn't stay in such a place. We move into a state of increasing activation, where there's more going on in our nervous system, where there are things like expectations, where there's stress, arguments, where we're sick, where we've got deadlines, where there's traffic congestion, when we slept in, when there's just an increase in our nervous system, and our sympathetic nervous system ramps up a little bit. And so it's this idea that there's more going on, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Anytime we compete, anytime we're exercising, anytime we're doing something where there's more of a load, our sympathetic nervous system has to increase its output. But ideally, we're able to regulate, and at the end of a stressful day, or for our children at the end of a stressful period, they're able to relax and have their nervous system kick back into a rest and digest and restore mode. But the reality is, we don't stay in these places of manageable activation. As Peter Levine said, trauma is inevitable. And so the inevitability of our fight or flight mechanism being kicked into its maximum is going to happen. And it's going to happen for our children. And what happens, and we've talked about it a little bit already, and it's that high activation of the sympathetic nervous system. It's the gas pedal is fully on. It's when there's been a threat and there is the urge to fight or flee. And traumatic experiences put the nervous system here. So does chronic stress and chronic anxiety and extreme discomfort. Pain is something that's going to activate the nervous system to its maximum as well. And that's that place that when we're here, here's the interesting thing that we need to know about our nervous system. A state of maximum fight or flight response is time limited. And our physical body and our brain can only handle being in this state for so long before it's going to do something very instinctive, and it's going to slam the brake on. And it's going to move us into a place of freeze or dissociation or disconnection. And as I said earlier, children often go here easily with traumatic experiences. And dissociation happens, or this disconnection happens, when our nervous system's overloaded. When there's too much stress, too much activation, when there's too much of this, and when we're not able to do this, when we live with too much of that place of high activation and stress, our body makes the decision, our nervous system makes the decision and throws the brake on. When we're unable to fight or flee, when the situation doesn't resolve itself. And it's this idea, again, that the gas pedal and the brake are fully on. And the reason we dissociate is because it does bring relief. It's not necessarily healthier, but it feels better often. There's often less of the anxious experience. There's kind of a numbing of everything that goes on in the body. There's sort of a disconnection from what's going on and what's being experienced. There's a numbing out from it. It doesn't mean that it's gone away. It just simply means that a person's capacity to stay connected to it has been disconnected. And so it's way less healthy because it's farther away from the place of connection, of being connected to your true self, of being able to have the connection with people that act as resources and tools and supports to bring us into that place of manageable activation. There's less of it. And so it's that idea that although it feels better, although dissociation feels better and there's less connection to the sensations of trauma, there's less connection to resource as well, and less connection to your true self or your child's true self. And dissociation isn't chosen. It's not something that somebody willfully chooses. It's often just this instinctive response to overwhelming stress, trauma, and activation in the nervous system. And in my work, I often work with adults who have substance abuse problems and addiction. And I really see this last category as being a place that I'll mention simply for the sake of explaining it. But this tends to be something that is the result of living in a highly dissociated state for a long period of time. And when substance abuse, for example, and it's common for teenagers or young, even kids as young as 11 and 12, to discover that alcohol or marijuana are chemical dissociators. They help bring that disconnection. When the nervous system is here, they'll use alcohol or marijuana to slam the brake on. It doesn't mean that it's healthier. It means that they're suddenly numb and shut down to it. And whenever we get somebody who lives in chronic states of substance abuse or addiction for long periods of time, their nervous system really moves into a place of, I've termed it oblivion. And it's really this idea that extreme activation that somebody has dissociated for a long period of time, and they've been utilizing unhealthy coping mechanisms of dissociation, disconnection, numbing. They're disconnected from their true self. That's when we start seeing things like chronic substance abuse and chronic addiction, chronic use of other mood-altering things like gaming or, excessive internet use, excessive pornography use, or other things, food issues, disordered eating, that are all meant to try to serve as a way of self-medicating, of dissociating, and that pattern gets so entrenched that it creates other problems, and it's that moving into even greater unhealth. that is the result of not getting the support that they need. So I want to talk a little bit, because I've taken you through this idea that there's this movement that our nervous system makes from a place of health into a place of real disconnection and real unhealth, and even those places of oblivion if we don't get the support. But here's the good news, is resilience is inherent in all of us. It's inherent in our children. And so if we have the ability to have an idea of what works, to help children move from a place of trauma and chronic stress, and rather than moving into a place of dissociation, how do we help them stay connected? How do we help them move through those places of fear and anxiety and pain, of trauma memories, of the way that trauma activates their body? And that's what also acts as a fearful place. If your body's lit up like a Christmas tree, it's really scary to be here. So if we can have tools that help children ground and settle and make sense of the sensations that they experience, they're going to be able to move through it and connect to those resources that help them move back into places of manageable activation. So that's why it's so important to understand the nervous system experiences and what goes on. And for you as a parent to be able to get a sense of where on the vortex your child is. Are they highly activated? Are they experiencing anger, anxiety, fear? Are they experiencing body sensations that actually freak them out a little bit? Because it's really uncomfortable to be in our bodies when our trauma activation or anxiety activation is really high. So ideally, we want to find tools or resources that help settle this and help somebody move back into a state of greater regulation. So I've listed some tools. This is where we want to help find what works for your child. And there's many different things. It's the idea that you want to help them settle this and make sense of it and normalize the fact that their tummy's going to be making a lot of noise, or they feel scared, or maybe their heart's beating a little bit too fast sometimes, or they have a hard time catching their breath, or they feel cold and sweaty, or different things. It's important to normalize that those are really, that's that scared energy that you're trying to help them settle. And so we can do breathing exercises. And I won't do any here, but it's really that idea that we can find tools to help children center their breathing and settle. And sometimes just having them notice that they're breathing can be a good thing, and notice what it feels like to breathe. Or there's relaxation exercises that are geared for children, and just helping them do progressive muscle relaxation, or as they're lying in bed, helping them learn how to relax their body. Or there's meditation apps that are perfect for children alone. Or you can do it with them, and they're visualizations and guided imagery that just helps children connect to what it feels like in their body and how they can connect back to that rest and digest part of their nervous system. And so that is one of the really important keys that's important to understand. I also want to introduce you to some books. If you haven't already found these resources, they're really important. And as I've referred to a few times, Peter Levine, and he's written a great book called Trauma Proofing Your Kids. And it takes you through a longer review of some of the things I've talked about this morning or today, and that idea that trauma is about what happens in the nervous system in the body, and ways that a parent can help their child work through some of those things. It's a fantastic resource. There's also, he's got a CD that is a way to work through some of that similar information called It Won't Hurt Forever. And then there's the Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel and Bryson that is another look at just helping understand the nervous system of your child and how you as a parent can help them settle. You're your child's best shot at recovering. And while it's certainly important to have support from the community of counselors and mental health professionals and doctors, there's really an important piece that a parent plays in that you are the one that knows your child best, and you are the one that they are going to calm down and ground with more than any other person. And so understanding that and helping them connect to that and helping create safety and helping them connect to a place of calm is the biggest gift that you can give to your children. It also means that you as a parent need to be able to connect to those places yourself. But it's that important piece of, if you're able to help yourself manage places of challenge for yourself and your children, your child will be able to move through places of difficulty as well. And so these are some concepts that I think are important to have presented this morning. And, you know, Liz, I think there might be some questions or comments that you have.
Oh, thank you so much, Carrie. That was just a wealth of very valuable information, and also gives us a much better understanding of what our bodies, our children's bodies, go through in a traumatic response or a traumatic event. And it really does make it it helps in knowing how to react if you understand where it's coming from. And it really is, and I think it's the parents will, your book suggestions are really great. And we also have, the parents can have the opportunity to relook at this, at your presentation. They can look at the webinar online as often as they like. And the parents and families can also find additional resources that are compiled by the Force, and they pertain to this topic. And you can access the list on the webinar. At the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little paper clip. That's the presentation file, and they'll have additional information for you. And also, if you need require further help from the contact the Force, and we can help you contact the support and services that you might need. But that was a wonderful presentation, and of course I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
These are, some of them have been forwarded to me by the community PIRs throughout the province, and I just have a few. And a few, as you see my list. I guess one of them was, I guess just for me, I was thinking about young children, and parents have witnessed or know their child has had this really frightening, let's say 1, 2 years old, just toddler, and had this really frightening altercation or whatever with a dog. And really scared the dog. The dog scared the child, and then the response was freeze, and I think, but continues to be a problem every time the dog is in the area, and they're little, right? And dogs, especially big dogs, that was really traumatic. That one first initial, especially. A situation, they come around the corner and they're faced with this dog, so they're not even prepared. They don't even see this dog walking down the street, and they have an issue. What would you recommend for parents to deal with that going forward? Because dogs are going to be in their life, right?
Yes. Well, and what I think is interesting, and that's why Peter Levine's book is so good, is that he goes through scenarios and he helps parents understand a variety of different things that they can do. And some of it is helping your child maybe move through exposure to a dog, whether it be a dog on a television, and helping them, and just being there and talking about, that it's okay to feel afraid, and I'm here, and then maybe gradually moving into more exposure, as long as the parent was there saying, I gotcha, I'm going to protect you, and can we, what happens, what do you notice happening? And it's hard if it's a toddler. but it's this idea that you want to help them regulate in the presence of something that's a little bit traumatic, right? And so moving that exposure from maybe just simply a picture of a dog and helping them be okay with that. And because you're gonna track what's going on. And of course, if you expose them to a dog, they're going to be very anxious. Mm-hmm. Start a little bit before that place of extreme anxiety, or maybe a smaller dog is something that's okay. And would it be okay just to sit beside one? And would it be okay to eventually pet one? And helping them move through that, but at the same time, never forcing the child to.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It does. It's just a process.
Yeah, and it's about the parent being the support and the source of, I gotcha, and I'm going to protect you, and we're going to see what happens and see if that being scared can shift a little bit.
Yes, that makes sense. That's helpful. So that would be similar to same idea for the parent. Like, let's say a child, you mentioned earlier about children having to go through medical. They've had to have undergo medical treatment that was really traumatic for them. And it was not a one-time thing. It's going to be an ongoing thing, and it's supporting them through that trauma, the anticipation of that again.
And again, Peter Levine refers to play therapy, and he talks a lot about how children will play out scenarios. And sometimes it can be helpful just as a parent to know what to look for or how to facilitate a child playing out anxious experiences or anticipatory things in play. And again, we don't have the time to go into depth in that, but they're great resources in the book that I suggested.
That's great. And that's what the resources are invaluable. They really are. I agree. One other thing that we came up with the PIRs is sometimes a trauma has been acknowledged, and that it's getting the other people that are involved with the child, like teacher, grandparents, even the other spouse, to believe that this is a trauma and how to deal with it, and how do you convince them and get everybody on board that it really is trauma.
That's more difficult, right? I would venture to say that our understanding of trauma has increased dramatically in the last number of years, but there still are a lot of professionals, a lot of mental health professionals, a lot of healthcare professionals who don't necessarily understand the breadth of traumatic experiences and minimize it. And that might be a common experience, right? For parents coming up against that in people that they're working with that don't necessarily understand the impact that an experience has had, or might try to minimize it. Regardless of that, you as the parent know, and you're still the most important person in your child's life. So
I agree. I agree, and that is very important for the parents to, and why they be watching this and looking for resources and so on, so they can get understand more, and in turn that helps their children, I believe. I don't know, I'm just looking to see if I have any more questions. More just a little bit, you mentioned that the children experience trauma differently from adults, and we were looking at the vortex. So the parents, the children just sort of go straight, more or less, to the freeze.
And part of it's, because out of the place that they're at developmentally, a 2-year-old doesn't have the resources that a 5-year-old does, or a 12-year-old does. And so they have no ability for their nervous system to respond in a more sophisticated way. And I wish we had more time to talk about it, but attachment relationships are really important. And when there is any kind of a threat in their attachment, their automatic response is a freeze response. That's just how, a young child is wired. because attachment relationships are so important, and it's life-threatening, actually, when they're threatened. And so it's an instinctive automatic response. And so, you know, attachment relationships are threatened when a child's ill, or when they're hospitalized, or when there's separation of any kind. So,
and so, yeah, you're right, and that's that, and it makes perfect sense too. I guess the only other thing I was thinking of is that we often think of our kids being anxious about things, that their reaction is anxiety and so on, but we chalk it up to just that. And is there times where we won't know that it's actually been triggered by a traumatic experience? It's anxiety, but I guess are they one? And do you know what I mean? That to differentiate.
It's hard to differentiate.
It
when,
is.
I mean, I would venture to say, and I'm probably going out on a limb, not all anxiety is trauma-based, but a lot of it is.
Okay. Yeah,
right? And a lot of it
sense.
are triggers, right? And if we think about how the nervous system, if it gets lit up by, like a Christmas tree, by you know, prenatal or perinatal experiences, if there's illness or if there's trauma in the first few years of life, then the nervous system of a child can be highly activated. And all of them are trauma related, but there might not be a specific thing that they recognize, oh, it's because of that.
Yes.
Right? It might not be as simple as, I got bit by a dog when I was 4. It could be, I had invasive medical procedures, or I was in an incubator, or my family was incredibly stressed in the first year of my life, or, you know, on and on. There's lots of different things. And it just fine-tunes the nervous system of a child to be more anxious and to be more activated and to be more easily triggered into those places.
That makes perfect sense, and that's wonderful. Thank you, Carrie, for answering all these questions, and I am glad everybody was able to join us, and we hope that you found the presentation helpful. We would like to hear from you. To provide us with feedback on this webinar, could you please click on the presentations link? It's an icon at the lower right hand of the screen, and it looks like a paperclip, and you'll find the feedback form and other resources there. And further to the feedback form, if you also have the option of entering to win a $50 Chapters gift card for filling out the feedback form. All the information is confidential and is only used to collect feedback from you that helps us develop our Future in the Know sessions and generate topic ideas. So thank you again to Carrie DeJong, and I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and we welcome you to visit our online video library anytime for more In the Know offerings. You can visit us at www.forcesociety.com/inthe-know. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carrie.